For 30 years, Johnny Carson appeared to America as the perfect host, warm, charming, effortlessly in control. Each night he stepped onto the Tonight Show stage with a smile that felt familiar, almost intimate, as if he belonged in every living room in the country. But behind that easy laugh lived a man with strict boundaries, a long memory, and a private code of loyalty that few understood until it was too late. Carson didn't raise his voice or explode in public. He punished with silence, with vanished invitations, with careers that suddenly lost their brightest spotlight. Producers spoke quietly about the invisible blacklist, a mental ledger only Carson could see. One mistake, sometimes small, sometimes seismic, could end a guest's relationship with the show forever. Why did certain offenses strike him so deeply? And how could a host who embodied civility become unforgiving the moment someone challenged the world he built so carefully? Night after night, Carson maintained the illusion of ease, but the guests who crossed his boundaries discovered how fragile that illusion truly was. Their stories reveal a man far more complex than the smile he shared with millions. And the first exile came from the person he loved like family. Joan Rivers wasn't just another comic passing through The Tonight Show. She was the closest thing Johnny Carson ever had to a chosen successor. He championed her in a way that surprised even his own staff, tweaking her jokes, inviting her to private dinners, praising her on air in a male-dominated industry that rarely granted women the microphone. Carson, who kept most people at a safe emotional distance, let Joan in. She became the rare person he trusted, the one who made him feel understood. And what happens to a man built on guardedness when the person he trusts most becomes the source of his deepest wound? By the mid-1980s, NBC had quietly informed Rivers she would not replace Carson when he eventually stepped down. The message stung. So when the newly formed Fox network offered Joan her own competing late-night show, creative control, a massive salary, and the promise of long-term stability, it wasn't just a career move. It was self-preservation. She planned to tell Carson. She rehearsed the conversation in her head. But each day she delayed, the fear of disappointing him grew heavier. Then Fox leaked the announcement before she ever picked up the phone. Carson learned of her new show not from Joan, but from a Variety headline. For a man shaped by childhood abandonment, a distant father, a mother whose approval never came, how could this feel like anything but a personal betrayal? He didn't yell, one staffer recalled. He just said, "She didn't even call me," and walked away. That was all it took. Joan's name was banned from the show. Her clips were removed from reruns. Guest hosts were instructed never to mention her. Hollywood, sensing Carson's disapproval, pulled away as well. Rivers rebuilt her career through sheer force of will, but she never escaped the shadow of that broken bond. Losing Johnny, she admitted years later, hurt more than losing the show. Carson could forgive ambition, but abandonment, especially from someone he loved, carved a wound that never healed. And if betrayal cut him deeply, public humiliation would ignite a fury even he struggled to hide. If Joan Rivers showed how betrayal could shatter Carson's trust, Shelley Winters revealed something even more volatile, how a single moment of public embarrassment could ignite a fury he almost never allowed the world to see. Winters was Hollywood royalty, 2 Oscars, decades of legendary roles, and a personality so fiery it bordered on myth. In her early years, that fire made her irresistible. By the 1970s, it was becoming unpredictable, especially as alcohol took a stronger hold on her life. Producers whispered nervously before each appearance, which Shelley were they getting tonight? Her pre-interview for this appearance was flawless. She was sharp, funny, and fully in control. But when she walked onto Carson's stage, something had changed. Her words slurred, her thoughts drifted. She interrupted Carson repeatedly, shifting topics without warning. He tried to steady the conversation, redirecting gently, laughing softly to ease the tension, guiding her back whenever she veered off course. But what does a man obsessed with composure do when the illusion he protects begins to crack on live television? Then came the breaking point. Carson made a harmless, lightly teasing remark, one Winters herself had joked about in previous visits. But this time, she snapped. Without a word, she hurled her entire glass of whiskey straight into Carson's face. Liquor, ice, humiliation, all under blinding studio lights before millions of viewers. The audience gasped. Carson froze. Then, with chilling calm, he called for a commercial break. Backstage, staff described him as white with anger, a rare and frightening sight. Winters was escorted out immediately and banned for life. To Carson, the offense wasn't intoxication. It was the violation of a sacred unspoken rule. Never humiliate the host. Her career continued, but without The Tonight Show, she lost one of the last platforms that still embraced her. Winters later admitted she deserved the ban, but the damage was irreversible. Carson could absorb chaos in private, but chaos delivered publicly, aimed at him, was unforgivable. But if Winters exposed how quickly Carson's patience could evaporate, the next encounter would reveal what happened when someone dared to challenge not his dignity, but his dominance. If Shelley Winters tested Carson's tolerance for public chaos, Wayne Newton tested something far more primal, the untouchable perimeter around Carson's personal authority. For years, Newton had been a favorite target of light Tonight Show teasing. The immaculate hair, the polished Vegas aura, the curiously ageless face. Carson's jokes were mild, almost affectionate, but Newton felt every punchline like a bruise under the surface. His image had been carefully curated, and Carson's humor, however gentle, threatened to crack it. So what does a man do when the world's most watched host starts shaping the version of him that millions believe? The real breaking point came when Carson crossed into more dangerous territory, joking about Newton's masculinity and sexuality, topics that, in the conservative entertainment climate of the 1980s, could cripple a career overnight. Newton didn't laugh. He didn't call. He didn't send a representative. Instead, he walked straight into NBC Burbank, past startled security guards, and into Carson's private office as if pulled by gravity. Carson looked up, expecting small talk. What he got was a quiet threat. "You can make fun of my music, you can make fun of my hair, but if you ever joke about my sexuality again, I'll kick your ass." Witnesses said the air seemed to flatten. Carson rose slowly, not angrily, but with a kind of chilling finality, and told Newton to leave before he had him removed. That was the entire exchange. Nothing more needed to be said. For Carson, this was not a disagreement. It was an incursion. And in his world, anyone who tried to dominate him, on stage or off, was erased without debate. Newton was banned permanently. No reconsideration, no negotiation. His national presence dimmed almost immediately.
Some conflicts bruise reputations. This one rewrote destinies.
And yet, even that confrontation paled next to the moment when a legendary writer walked on stage so undone that Carson had to protect the show from him in real time. If Wayne Newton showed how fiercely Carson defended his authority, Truman Capote revealed the one situation Carson feared even more, a guest unraveling so completely that The Tonight Show itself risked falling apart. Capote had once been a beloved talk show fixture, brilliant, wickedly funny, effortlessly captivating. But by 1975, addiction had hollowed him out. Friends saw the decline. Producers sensed it too. Yet no one predicted just how stark the deterioration would appear under studio lights. Capote wobbled slightly as he reached his chair, his eyes glassy, his smile delayed by a beat. When Carson asked his first question, the response drifted into half-coherent fragments, punctuated by long, disorienting pauses. Carson immediately shifted into his discreet rescue mode, simplifying questions, offering gentle laughter, trying to wrap structure around Capote's crumbling composure. But how do you salvage an interview when the guest can't hold on to a single thread? Then Capote veered into a story about a Hollywood party so explicit that it couldn't legally air. Carson's eyes tightened. With a soft, "We'll be right back," He cut to commercial far earlier than scheduled, a rare emergency maneuver in his meticulously controlled world. Backstage, witnesses recalled a moment of intimate disappointment rather than anger. Carson leaned in and said quietly, "Truman, you're not well tonight." Capote tried to protest, but the slurred words only echoed the truth.
A segment meant to last 10 minutes ended at 4. Capote was ushered out gently but firmly, and the decision was immediate. He would never return to The Tonight Show. The band wasn't punitive, it was protective. Carson believed the audience trusted him to maintain dignity, clarity, and a certain emotional safety. Capote's collapse violated all three.
For Capote, the consequences were lasting. Losing Carson's platform meant losing access to millions of readers at a time when his career desperately needed stability. The Tonight Show couldn't save him, and Carson wouldn't risk the show to try. Some bands came from anger. This one came from sorrow.
Yet, the next guest would test Carson not through collapse or confrontation, but by introducing a new kind of television that threatened the very identity of The Tonight Show itself. If Truman Capote forced Carson to confront a guest collapsing under the weight of his own demons, Morton Downey Jr. presented the opposite problem, a man who thrived on chaos and arrived determined to unleash it on someone else's stage. Downey was the face of a new, combative style of television, confrontational, brash, engineered to provoke rather than entertain. His studio audiences roared like crowds at a prize fight. His interviews resembled brawls more than conversations. And what happens when a host who spent decades cultivating elegance is confronted by a man who sees disorder as opportunity? Controversy swirled even before his booking. Several Tonight Show producers warned that Downey's presence could taint the program's reputation. Others argued he was too culturally relevant to ignore. Carson reluctantly agreed, but sensed trouble long before Downey stepped through the curtain. The moment he appeared, Downey behaved as though The Tonight Show belonged to him. Instead of sitting, he prowled the stage, playing to the audience with a swagger that bordered on disrespect. When Carson began the interview, Downey cut him off repeatedly, raising his voice, shifting attention toward himself, and ignoring every cue that defined The Tonight Show's rhythm. Carson attempted humor, gentle redirects, even pointed questions meant to anchor the conversation. None of it mattered. Downey wasn't there to talk, he was there to dominate. The breaking point arrived when Downey criticized other talk show hosts as weak, thinly veiled contempt aimed directly at Carson. For a split second, Carson's expression hardened, and the crew recognized a rare moment, the host withdrawing his warmth entirely. Once Carson emotionally stepped back, the interview was effectively over. The segment ended early. Backstage, Carson dismissed Downey with a single sentence. "That's not television, that's a stunt." There was no formal announcement, no dramatic ban. Downey's name simply disappeared from all future booking conversations. Carson wasn't punishing behavior. He was defending identity. The Tonight Show, in his view, was a sanctuary of wit and civility, two qualities Downey never pretended to value. And yet, political disruption, not theatrical chaos, would define the next conflict that pushed Carson to quietly close his doors once more. If Morton Downey Jr. tested Carson's boundaries by overwhelming the room with noise, the Smothers Brothers violated something subtler, but far more sacred to him, The Tonight Show's promise to be a refuge from the country's political battles. Tom and Dick Smothers were talented, sharp, and widely admired, but they were also the faces of a cultural revolt. Their CBS variety show, infamous for its clashes with network censors over anti-war content, had turned them into symbols of resistance. So what happens when symbols walk into a space designed expressly to avoid taking sides? Carson respected their artistry. He appreciated their timing, their wit, their musicality. But unlike them, he built his career on neutrality, on joking about politics without ever stepping into politics. He believed Americans came to The Tonight Show not to be challenged, but to breathe. That philosophy shaped every decision he made. During a 1970 appearance, the brothers were booked for a light segment, banter,
A song, a bit of sibling comedy. But once they sat down, Tom's tone shifted. He launched into a pointed anti-war message, moving far beyond anything discussed in pre-interview. The air tightened immediately. Carson smiled politely, but his eyes flattened with a familiar warning. Someone had just turned his sanctuary into a soapbox. How could the show maintain its equilibrium if guests used it as a political platform? Carson finished the segment professionally, never revealing the anger building beneath the surface. Backstage, however, he delivered a decisive verdict. Too much trouble for what we get. It wasn't a ban, but it was worse in some ways. The brothers slipped into what staff quietly called Carson Purgatory. Their names stayed on lists, but every suggestion to book them again met with a gentle but firm excuse. They appeared only rarely and always under strict instructions to avoid controversy.
To the Smothers Brothers, it felt like censorship. To Carson, it was preservation. He wasn't punishing their beliefs, he was guarding the identity of a show that millions trusted to be a nightly escape.
And yet the next conflict wouldn't be political at all. It would be personal, subtle, and rooted in the fragile line between comedy and cruelty.
If the Smothers Brothers strained Carson's patience by dragging politics onto his stage, Charles Grodin tested something far more intimate: Carson's deepest insecurities about authenticity. On paper, Grodin should have been an ideal guest, sharp, inventive, and quick enough to play off Carson's rhythm. But Grodin didn't arrive with charming anecdotes or polished punchlines. He arrived with a persona, a deliberately confrontational version of himself that pushed tension to the edge of discomfort. And what happens when performance blurs so thoroughly with reality that even a master host can't tell where the act ends?
Grodin's first appearances were a novelty. He challenged Carson lightly, feigned irritation, teased him about not reading his book. Carson played along beautifully, and the audience loved the unpredictable dynamic. But with each return visit, Grodin pushed harder. He interrupted Carson, criticized his interviewing, and questioned whether Carson genuinely cared about his guests or was simply coasting on routine. For a host who guarded his emotional distance carefully, that suggestion struck at a wound no one was supposed to touch. How could he laugh freely when someone hinted the warmth he projected each night might be hollow? The breaking point came during a taping in 1990. Grodin leaned into his antagonistic character more aggressively than ever, mocking Carson's delivery and implying he was disengaged from the very show he built. Carson's smile didn't fade, but it stiffened, an unmistakable sign to anyone who knew him. Behind the desk, he maintained the performance. Off camera, he ended the partnership instantly. "We're done with that," he told his producer the moment they cut to commercial. "No debate, no explanation. Just dismissal." Grodin wasn't formally banned. He was simply never invited back. His team called, Carson's staff politely deflected. The door had closed without a sound. For Carson, the issue wasn't the jokes, it was the implication behind them. He could weather mockery, but not an attack on the sincerity he worked so hard to project. And yet even Grodin's subtle jabs couldn't match the quiet friction brewing with another Tonight Show regular, one whose legend rivaled Carson's, and whose presence exposed a different kind of threat entirely. If Charles Grodin unsettled Carson by poking at his insecurities, Bob Hope challenged him in a way far more corrosive, by unintentionally undermining the very craft Carson believed defined The Tonight Show. Hope wasn't just another guest, he was a national monument, a figure so towering that producers treated his appearances as untouchable. But what happens when reverence begins to suffocate authenticity? Whenever Hope visited the show in his later years, he arrived with pre-written jokes, rigid cue cards, and a structured routine that left little room for spontaneity. Carson, whose genius relied on effortless improvisation, found himself trapped in segments that felt canned and mechanical. Crew members later recalled how Carson's energy shifted. He stopped reacting naturally. He just carried Bob through it. Hope's reliance on cue cards increased as he aged, and Carson often had to finish Hope's timing, guide punchlines, and smooth over missed beats, yet pretend Hope was steering the moment.
To Carson, this violated an unspoken principle. Conversations, especially on his stage, should feel alive. But how could they, when every line was predetermined? He never confronted hope. Respect, and perhaps guilt, kept him silent. But internally, the strain grew. Carson wanted the show to evolve, to stay sharp and modern. Hope, meanwhile, expected The Tonight Show to continue revolving around him, as if the industry hadn't changed. Could Carson maintain the show's vitality while honoring a legend who no longer fit its rhythm? Eventually, the solution became quiet distance. Invitations slowed. Segments shortened. Producers stopped pushing for Hope's appearances. Nothing was said aloud. Carson hated confrontation, but everyone understood what the silence meant. Hope didn't explode or protest. He simply faded from the booking schedule, a legend gently ushered into the background of a show he once dominated. And yet the next vanishing act wouldn't come from age or legacy. It would come from a performer Carson felt had simply stopped evolving, someone whose charm had worn thin because it never changed. If Bob Hope represented a legacy Carson struggled to outgrow, Rich Little represented a different kind of frustration. The slow realization that a reliable guest had stopped bringing anything new. For years, Little was a Tonight Show favorite, celebrated for impressions so precise they seemed supernatural. He could fill a segment effortlessly, and Carson appreciated how Little's mimicry energized the audience. But what happens when a performer's greatest strength Little loved staying on. Whether the cameras were rolling or not, he performed impressions constantly. Nixon in the hallway, Jimmy Stewart during pre-interview, Carson himself at commercial breaks. Audiences adored it, but Carson, who valued authenticity in private moments, found the non-stop act increasingly draining. Was Little performing for the show, or performing for validation? Worse, Carson began recognizing that many of Little's routines were recycled. Lines he'd used in the 70s resurfaced in the 80s with barely a change. Punchlines he delivered on earlier visits reappeared in later segments. Carson prided himself on freshness and had near photographic recall for jokes. So when he noticed Little repeating material, he felt something shift. If the impressions weren't evolving, then what was the point of bringing him back? Still, Carson never confronted him. He simply made a quiet decision, the kind he reserved for people who disappointed him without committing a dramatic offense. The invitations stopped. Whenever Little's team called, producers replied with polite deflections. Bad timing, busy schedule, different direction. Little didn't understand at first. In interviews years later, he admitted he kept waiting for a call that never came. Only when a former staffer explained Carson's view did he realize the truth. Johnny thought I wasn't giving him anything new. For Carson, it wasn't anger, it was principle. The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment, it was craftsmanship. And craftsmanship demanded growth, not repetition. But if Little's ban was rooted in creative stagnation, the next one would be rooted in something far more dramatic, a brilliant mind unraveling on live television, pushing Carson's boundaries of professionalism to their limit. In the end, these 9 bans reveal a side of Johnny Carson the public rarely saw, a man who protected his stage with the same intensity others reserve for protecting their homes. Behind the charming grin and effortless timing lived an exacting host who believed The Tonight Show was a promise, a space built on professionalism, balance, and respect. When guests violated that promise, whether through betrayal, intimidation, chaos, politics, repetition, or personal collapse, some bans were heartbreaking, some inevitable, others surprising in how small the triggering moment seemed. But together, they form a portrait of a man who understood that millions trusted him to keep the show steady, even when the industry around him shifted toward noise, controversy, and spectacle. His decisions weren't always fair, and they weren't always kind, but they were always deliberate. Now, the question becomes yours. Which of these bans shocked you the most? Do you think Carson was justified, or did he sometimes guard his throne too fiercely? And if you had been in his position, which guest would you have allowed back? Share your thoughts, reactions, and opinions below. We'd love to hear how you see this complicated legacy.